The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to be tackling a really interesting question of financial deficits across the states, a little bit of a special focus on California. And to help us do that, we have two eminent guests, Steve Malanga, who is the senior fellow at Manhattan Institute and senior editor for the City Journal publication that they publish, and former state senator, former Orange County Treasurer, and Orange County Supervisor John Moorlach, who's lived this live in his lifetime in Orange County. Gentlemen, welcome. Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'll start off with you, Steve. I've been reading your stuff in City Journal for a long time. This financial crisis that's affecting states and cities has been going on for a long time. Is your sense that it's getting worse and sort of the debt is inexorable?
Well, at this point, the COVID, inserted itself, if you will, into the whole picture, and in ways that nobody anticipated. When COVID first, when the lockdowns first began, people thought, the states were just going to go bankrupt because they were already sitting on all this debt, including pension debt. Instead, several things happened. The first thing is that starting with the Trump administration, then the Biden administration, they sent hundreds of billions of dollars to states and cities and school districts and local governments. At the same time, they sent a lot of money to people. And so the savings rate in America, the household saving rate actually rose. As a result of all this, what was supposed to be budget deficits turned into actually a lot of budget surpluses, including in California. Just a couple of years ago, in the middle of COVID. Now, a lot of people warned that the problem was that a lot of this was one-time government money. In fact, it was money the government was kind of printing, or the electronic version of printing, and that when it went away, state budgets would be in trouble, and municipal budgets and school budgets especially around the country. That is exactly what we're starting to see right now. What we've seen a tremendous decline in tax collections at the state level, particularly economically sensitive taxes. What I mean by economically sensitive, like income taxes, corporate income taxes, and individual income taxes. In 2023, in the aggregate, state income tax collections declined by about 11%. Corporate income taxes also declined. What didn't go down were things like property tax collections because, of course, they kind of roll over in a number of years. At the same time, a lot of states spent all the money that Trump and then Biden had sent them. And as a result of that, at this point, we see a lot of states struggling with deficits of varying degrees, although California just blows everybody else out of the water, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about. So that's where we are kind of right now. And we're back to, all that debt never went away. And a lot of states took this government money and they spent it to do things like paper over deficits. And now, the fiscal reckoning that people suggested was going to come after COVID is here.
Well, John, how does that square with how you see things here in the great golden state of California?
Well, Marshall and Joel, it's great to be with you, and it's a real honor to see Steve. We've talked over the years, so thank you for joining us. But Steve hit it right on the nose. In California, we saw rising revenues year after year since Gavin Newsom came into office. He started with a budget that Jerry Brown, his predecessor, Governor Brown, Brown's last budget was at $126.5 billion, and in the last 5 years, Gavin Newsom has taken it up to $240.1 billion. So it's almost doubled. But Newsom has sort of been living the normal life where people think that yesterday is today is tomorrow. And if my revenues went up 20% this year and last year, they're going to go up 20% the next year. And hubris kicks in, and he had just been spending all this money, and he didn't take any of it and reduce debts. He didn't reduce the pensions. He didn't reduce OPEB, or we call it retiree medical or other post-employment benefits. But worse off is that he did not reduce the debts with borrowings from the federal government to pay for unemployment benefits. So another problem we have in California is that we don't have a good accounting system. We spend over $1 billion for software, and we still can't get a financial statement out in time. Every state has to prepare an annual comprehensive financial report. It should be out within 6 months, usually December. And we just got the June 30 financial report audit for California for June 22. We just got it in April of 24. And what it revealed is that we picked up another $47 billion in debt for unemployment benefits, or paying those out from the federal government, which is really remarkable because, as Steve pointed out, every state got CARES Act money, lots of it, and they all improved. 47 of the 50 states improved their financial situation by reducing either their unrestricted net deficit or improving their unrestricted net assets. But California dropped $47 billion, more than 20%. So we've had such an amazing case of mismanagement here in California.
Now, when Steve, you add in, hold on just a sec, when you add in the obligatory spending on pensions for public employees to this new level of debt from the CARES Act and from other new indebted areas, how do the lines ever cross? I mean, how do they ever get rid of this? Are there any solutions to solving this problem?
Let's attack two issues. One is pension debt, and the other is other post-employment benefit debt. So California gives lifetime medical benefits to its retirees. That's created an unfunded actuarial accrued liability of over $90 billion. So let me give a personal story. When I was elected supervisor for the County of Orange, the unions, the public employee unions, said, we want raises. And so we said, fine, what are you going to give us? How about if we modify our retiree medical plan? It's at $1.4 billion underwater. And so we negotiated. We changed so many parts of the terms in the deal. I don't want to get into the specifics, but the unions agreed to those terms, and we reduced the unfunded liability from $1.4 billion to $400 million, 71%. And as a senator, when I was on the Budget and Finance Committee, I kept repeating to the Department of Finance, why don't we work on reducing the OPEBs? Here's what we did in Orange County, and they always blew me off. But if we had done that at the state of California, at the state level, we could remove $63 billion from our balance sheet. The other is the pension debt. In 1999, a bill passed, SB 400, that improved pension benefits by 50%. And CalPERS, the California Public Employee Retirement System, doesn't do math very well. So instead of having a two-tier system where you say, okay, after this is adopted, we prospectively give you, a new formula after this date, and you stay with the old formula, they decided to make it retroactive to the date of hire. So when you have a fully funded pension plan in 1999, when the dot-com boom was in place, and you're 100% funded, but if you improve benefits by 50%, overnight you become 2/3 funded. So here we are, literally a quarter century later, and we're still at 71%. We have not picked up or retired that debt, and so you're paying all this additional interest, 7%, and it's just been an onerous thing. So how do you address that? Well, Governor Brown said, okay, new formulas for new hires. Some states have gotten a little more aggressive. I'll give the case of Wisconsin, where they said, we're going to go to a shared risk defined benefit pension plan. So if you look at any rankings of pensions of states, you'll always see Wisconsin at the top. And what a shared risk defined benefit plan does is it says to the employees, if we don't earn what we're supposed to earn, then you have to increase your contributions. We will share the risk, as opposed to the state and the taxpayers be completely. So there are remedies, usually you can implement something like Wisconsin did if you're in bankruptcy court, but states can't go into bankruptcy court.
Steve, are we seeing the same things, or is California uniquely horrible?
Well, funny you say that, because as you were talking about this, I was thinking of the New York State budget. In New York State, when things got so terrible after the so-called Great Recession of 2008, 2009, Andrew Cuomo and some local leaders like Mike Bloomberg, who was the mayor at the time of New York City, actually did pension reform in New York State, very similar to what you're talking about in California, because the New York State Constitution protects the benefits of everyone already working. But what they did was they rolled back, they lessened the benefits for new employees. Now, it takes a long time for those kinds of savings to accrue, but it has been a long time. And New York State is now getting those kinds of savings. So what's going on now? In this latest budget, the employee unions are fighting essentially to roll back those reforms. That they're using a very kind of obscure argument, which essentially says that if public employees don't belong to Social Security, and they don't have to, unlike those of us in the private sector, if they don't belong to Social Security, then their pension system has to at least equal Social Security. Now, they're trying to claim that their pension system now does not equal even Social Security benefits, which, believe me, it more than does. And I won't go into all of the financial, machinations here, but we're already seeing this in New Jersey, in New York rather, and there's pushback in New Jersey also. Although there, I think the governor is aware that they're on such thin ice already, even compared to places like California, that any attempt to do anything like that will really get them in trouble. So yes, welcome to 2024.
And the state of California did something very unique when Jerry Brown was governor. He sat down with Janet Napolitano, the chancellor for the University of California system, and said, if you want more funding from Sacramento, then you're going to have to implement a defined contribution plan for new hires. In other words, when someone comes onto the faculty of University of California, they have a choice either to go in the defined benefit plan or a defined contribution plan, which is like a 401k.
Versus a pension, just to help.
Well, it is a pension, but it's what the private sector has adopted. And what they found is that 27% or more of new hires said, we'll take the DC because it's portable. We're not going to be here for a long time. We'll take it with us. Well, when I was in the Senate on the budget committee, I was one of two Republican senators where we met with the Assembly. They tried to eliminate that plan every year because unions find defined contribution plans anathema.
Steve? Yeah,
what I was going to say is we actually at the Manhattan Institute did some surveys of teachers, for instance. A lot of teachers, most teachers in blue states at least, they have these defined benefit pensions. The thing is, there's a lot of turnover in education, and many teachers leave the system they're in after 10 years. Under a defined benefit plan, they don't do very well because they're not portable. You can't take them somewhere else, the money. And they're during the first 10 years in a defined benefit plan, you don't really accrue a lot of benefits. It's not like, like we're going to put 6% a year in every year under a defined contribution plan. So we did some surveys and found that about 50% of teachers said if they had the defined contribution option, they would take it. So this is something that the unions, who essentially are run by longtime union leaders and are run for some of the senior people, that's their target. They want to foreclose these options for their core long-term membership, including themselves. But a lot of younger members, they would like that option, and those of us who have moved jobs 3 or 4 times in our lives, we can tell you it's a pretty good thing actually to have that kind of portability.
Yeah. So here it is. We're in a situation where a lot of states, including California, are suddenly saying, oh my God, I've got this huge current deficit that I'm going to have to plug. Educate us a little bit about what typically happens. How do they fix that in the short term? What kind of cuts do we expect? Where do those cuts typically come from? And how do they kind of merchandise all of that to the public.
And what happens if they can't get those cuts through because of the political situation? So,
well, speaking for California, the majority of the tax revenues that the state receives are from personal income taxes. And so when you look at the number of taxpayers in California and you look at their taxable income levels, 1% of the state's population provides 50% of the personal income tax revenues. So we really need to encourage the 1%ers.
That's 40,000 people, just 40,000 tax returns, just to give people a sense of how vulnerable we are. So keep going.
So we discussed this. I was on a panel and I said, shouldn't we be giving these 40,000 people a nice fruit basket every year to say, hey, thank you very much for the amount of revenue you're providing to the state? I called a donor of mine when I was running. I called him up. I said, you live in Henderson, Nevada? He says, yes. I said, why did you give me $4,900? Because he says, John, I own businesses in Orange County, California, Arizona, and Nevada. My CPAs said, if I stay in California, it's gonna cost me $10,000 a day in personal income taxes. So I could buy a mansion for $3.5 million here in Henderson and pay for it with 1 year's savings on my personal income taxes. So we want to have a real problem because personal income taxes are cyclical. If the economy is doing good, then personal income taxes do good. When the economy goes down, then personal income taxes go down. And what's even more awkward is that a big component of personal income comes from capital gains. So if you're not selling stock and making profits and you're in a down market, your income drops dramatically. So we had a governor in Jerry Brown who was always cautious about preparing annual budgets. He was very concerned. He emphasized a rainy day fund. And so he was very cautious. But with Gavin, he's just been going up Silly Hill. Every year we spend it all. We get an increase, we spend it all. He didn't retire any debt. So it's sort of like the guy who has high credit card debts, and then he gets a bonus, and he puts it as a down payment on a very expensive car. He doesn't pay down the credit card debts. So here we are after
and then he gets laid off. Budget, he gets laid off 3 months later.
Yeah, we still have all these debts, and he's added to it with this unemployment insurance borrowing. And what's tragic about unemployment insurance is that if the state doesn't repay the federal government, then the employers in the state have to pay a higher FUTA tax, a Federal Unemployment Tax Act. They have to pay a higher tax. I had one business owner call me, and she was surprised that the state didn't pay off their loan. And so she got a $4,000 bill in December from her payroll tax service because the state hadn't paid it off. And she's crying on the phone. She says, I run a little restaurant. That $4,000 was supposed to be my Christmas bonus. What do I do now? I got to, so we are hurting the 1%ers on so many different ways or so many different directions that there's a lot of things that have to be revamped. We have to rethink our taxing system. We have to rethink how we set aside funds every year to prepare for down cycles. At least Jerry Brown went through depressions and recessions, and Gavin, what? Yes.
And people wonder why we have net outmigration from California, not counting the recent increase in international migration.
And including, particularly for the first time in our history, the migration of wealthy people out of the state. Steve, I assume New York, New Jersey, Illinois have similarly cheery situations.
Here's what I want to say. What John is describing in California is an extreme version of what's going on in many states. And that is, if you will go back to the 1950s and you look at state revenues until the year 2000, every year state revenues went up, at least marginally, even during recessions. They always went up slightly. They didn't jump a lot. The reason was, for decades, state revenues were not based on progressive income tax systems. But increasingly, around the country, states and even cities have instituted progressive income tax systems that are extremely volatile. And so between 1950 and 2000, I think there was maybe 1 year in a recession. Even in the 70s, state taxes always just grew a little bit. Since 2000, from 2000 to like 2019, this is even before COVID, we had 3 years in which state revenues declined. Volatility is the enemy of state and local government, right? Because they have basic services you have to deliver. You have all these commitments you have to make, and they don't have nearly the maneuverability of some businesses to respond when they have to respond. So I mean, you got to pick up the garbage, right? You need public safety. In fact, sometimes you need that more during a recession. So this is a phenomenon that's going on around the country. In fact, I was just looking at a chart in 2023, I believe there were at least 13 states that saw a decline in revenues from 1 year to another. So not just a slowing, but a decline in revenues. That used to be unprecedented. So it's something that's happening around the country, and it's the kind of progressive, advanced systems that are extremely tax systems. They're extremely volatile.
Well, which that kind of implies that we need to be moving toward less volatile systems like sales tax, VAT taxes, things that use fees.
That would be the same thing.
Well, I was going to say, are we seeing that? What's the zeitgeist out there?
Well, in California,
yes, there are actually states that, for instance, in the unexpected increase in revenues during COVID, some states use some of the extra money to lower tax rates and even to aim for a flat tax. The flat tax is kind of back among Republicans, not necessarily among Democrats, but among Republicans. And you guys may remember when Gavin Newsom debated Ron DeSantis. Remember how Gavin Newsom called DeSantis's flat tax structure in California, in Florida, regressive because it didn't tax the higher income people more.
So what about California? Are we seeing any move, John, in this regard? Just as a consumer, I kind of feel like I'm seeing more use fees. I'm seeing my car registration fees go up and those kinds of things. Is this just tip of the iceberg, or are we going to see a lot more of that? Is there a sense that this is the way to go in California?
The first thing I'd like to say is out of respect for Senator Robert Hertzberg, who I enjoyed working with for 6 years in the state Senate, I tried to help him every year with a bill that would try to find other ways to address the volatility that Steve is referring to. It was just not going to go anywhere. If you have to raise one tax somewhere to lower a tax somewhere else, you had to start charging maybe sales tax so that you had to pay sales tax on your fees or services from lawyers and accountants. And it was just, but it would reduce something somewhere else. And so the Chamber of Commerce for the state of California calls that whack-a-mole. Something's going to, pop up somewhere else. So all I can say is that for California, the weather's great.
So we should have a weather tax
when
now.
Arnold was governor, he tried to juggle some of the revenues. And so we called it the triple flip. We gave him sales tax and he gave us property tax. So for Orange County, the county government, 92% of its revenue comes from property taxes. Cities, property taxes, sales taxes, school districts, property taxes, and funding from the state. So it gets really dicey then when revenues decline. And that's the big question. I guess the big question would be when we get to it is what do we cut? How do we cut? But we've only seen one bill so far, and it reduced spending by $17.3 billion for the state. And terms were really great. We have spending cuts. We're using borrowing, delays, fund shifts, deferrals, all in this bill. and they only cut spending by $3.6 billion. That's it. But we're seeing buzzwords like spending freeze. We're seeing the potential of halting raises. We're hearing public employee unions already saying you're breaking promises. So I think that's where we have to go, is you have to make cuts. Personal story, I was chairman of the Board of Supervisors in Orange County, and Orange County has a population of that's greater than 20 states, 20% of the states, and we had to go through the recession, the Great Recession. 2008 was the Great Recession. We laid off 1,000 people, which was a big percentage of our workforce. But I think Gavin Newsom is stuck. He is in his position because the public employee unions brought him there, and he will find it impossible to make layoffs and cuts. And it's going to be quite interesting to see what happens May 15 when the budget revise comes out. And how is he going to narrow the gap? And where is he going to borrow the money from? What reserves is he going to exploit? But I don't think you're going to see very much in the way of layoffs or eliminating programs that are unnecessary that have been added on. Arnold, blew up the boxes, didn't blow up, maybe blew up one. But all these new things, say like Cal Savers, which the state has no reason to be asking employers to do a defined contribution plan for its employees and sending the money to the employment development department. We don't need another department with employees that get these massive pensions and retiree benefits where the private sector can take good care of it for much less. So you won't see outsourcing either. This is really kind of interesting. So this is going to be a come to Jesus moment for Newsom and for the public employee unions.
I assume it's the same around the country, Steve.
I think it's certainly the same in Illinois and New York and New Jersey. I think we're seeing smaller versions of it in other places, not necessarily on the precipice. But the crucial issue is, if you look at state budgets and the relationship to states and so in states that are politically competitive, right, they do tend to swing back and forth so that as you get these kinds of budget restrictions that result in either cutbacks or tax increases, you tend to see a swing towards Republican governors. The classic example of this is after Barack Obama was elected president, and the midterms and the 2 years after that, there's a whole wave of Republican governors come in, and then we saw all this tax cutting at the state level. We've kind of seen something like that with the extra money that we saw from the federal government and giving states surpluses. It was the Republican states that cut taxes, whereas the Democratic states spent the money. And now I think we're seeing more fiscal stress. The problem for places like New York, California, Illinois, and New Jersey is I don't know if they're politically competitive anymore. And so how do you get reform if they're not competitive? You talked about outmigration before. What COVID did was it sent outmigration into hyperdrive. The numbers are extraordinary. One of the things I did in a story I just wrote for City Journal in the print issue a couple of issues ago is I looked at the way the political composition of those states is changing as a result of the outmigration. And these are states that used to be relatively competitive when things got bad. You know what I mean? Like New York could kick Mario Cuomo out and elect George Pataki, right? Or New Jersey could kick out Florio and elect Chris Christie, or of course Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? I mean, could get elected in a recall election. I'm not even sure that's possible anymore. And so one of the things I think we're testing is just how far a progressive ideology, can take these states before you get either a meltdown or a reform wave that's strong enough to make a difference in these places.
Well, you're looking at the kind of political tensions that are building here. There are also some very serious dollars and cents financial tensions. And I know that you've done a lot of work in this area, John, of looking at I was going to say how high is up, but I suppose it's really how low is low, how low is down, in terms of the capacity that states have to actually solve the problem by bringing on new debt. Strikes me from the work that you've shared with me that states are coming up against some serious limits in terms of their own financeability. Could you tell us really kind of where we're at with that?
I would probably like to repeat what Steve said. States like New Jersey are seeing hedge fund managers move to Florida where there's no personal income tax, and yet then their state legislature has to have a special hearing just to discuss one person moving out of state and what the fiscal impact was on its budget. So I'm looking. I look at all the financial statements of all the 50 states and where they're going, and the reason is that last year there were in 2023 of the publicly traded companies that filed for bankruptcy, half of them came as a surprise to investors because the CPA firm was supposed to put a going concern opinion with the audit saying, we don't think this company is going to be here in the next 12 months. I have only seen that once on a government financial report, but taxpayers don't know what kind of condition they're in. Illinois is so far underwater. New Jersey, Connecticut, it's so if you want to raise taxes in California, we have the highest personal income tax, we have the highest gas tax, we have the highest sales tax. We're getting close now with property tax, and so the knee jerk reaction is always, well, let's raise taxes. This state, California, has even looked at wealth tax. If you have a net value of 30 million or more, we want to get a percentage of that. We've even had a bill that said, hey, even if you move out of state, we're going to tax you for the next 10 years. That we'll go down 10%
an exit tax,
and it's just this. It's crazy. So maybe California needs to think a little differently. Maybe it should take advantage of one of its natives, Art Laffer, and say maybe we ought to be reducing certain taxes to increase volume. And when you increase the volume, you actually increase the amount of taxes. Ronald Reagan proved this back in 1986. Maybe our state has to quit doing the knee jerk, because that's the only solution that public employee unions have, is raise taxes. And they don't want to cut. They can expand when times are good, but they can't contract. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to rethink that whole thing. But being a governor that's a Republican, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, he turned into a girly man in short order. So when you're a Republican governor in California with a legislature that is more than 2/3 Democrat, I never saw when I was in the Senate that we overturned a veto from the governor. But I can only see if there were a Republican, I or anybody were a Republican governor, you'd have all your vetoes overturned. It's like, how can we change the momentum of this nonsense?
So, as we get towards a conclusion, what I really wonder is what can we imagine 10 years from now in states like New York, like California, like New Jersey? Are these the future Argentinas of America? Are they, and what's the social effect? I mean, if you keep raising taxes, people who make money will leave. I mean, that seems to be kind of, at some level, it becomes impossible. You have expanding welfare state, and what is it? New York City, they're giving credit cards to the illegal migrants.
Debit cards, yeah.
Debit cards, $10,000 debit card. I don't know. You should maybe send one to me. And then, you have these increased expenditures. In California, we have free health care for the undocumented. There doesn't seem to be any way of stopping it. So if you look ahead 5 to 10 years, what happens? Where do we go? What's the reality in these states?
So my fear is that the answer to this is to look at upstate New York, because upstate New York has been in decline for decades, 3, 4, 5 decades. Eliot Spitzer, when he was a candidate for governor, called upstate New York. He famously said he compared it to Appalachia.
Yeah.
Upstate New York, just it's just been depopulated, deindustrialized, and lots of abandoned buildings and lots of a tremendous decline in the population of the cities. It is possible for that to happen. It's called managed decline. The economists, two economists at Wharton, I forget their names, but they're very popular economists, talked about even how cities like Detroit is a good example, how they can just decline and then, half the people leave and the cost gets so low that they become just essentially a place for lower income people and a few very rich people who can kind of afford to, live in that environment and survive in that environment. I mean, that's not impossible that you can just get a long-term managed decline. I've seen it in upstate New York. And if anything happens to New York City that's similar, essentially the tax base in New York State just disappears. So that's not impossible by any means. And I think Illinois is already going through this. One of the things, we spend so much time talking about Chicago, which has its own problems, but rural and suburban Illinois, which used to be an industrial powerhouse, has lost so much vitality, has lost so many jobs. You now have all of these employers in places like Indiana and Wisconsin actually getting rural Illinois residents to come to work at their plants. They can attract those people. They're advertising to those people. I mean, I remember when Mitch Daniels, when he was governor of Indiana, he famously said, living next to Illinois is like living next to Homer Simpson, living next to the Simpsons. No. They were like their own worst enemy.
That's very funny. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, and I'm surprised that this day of reckoning hasn't come sooner. I think the two things that happened in the last 12 years or so, one is Donald Trump, if I could invoke his name. Obama, for 8 years, the economy was just flat. Nothing happened. Stock market was flat. I did not anticipate it, but when Trump got elected, the stock market went up 25%. The economy bursted, and all of a sudden, pension plans are starting to recover. What I didn't expect, number two, is Joe Biden, giving all this money to all these states, counties, cities. But now we're sort of here. And so I've been through a bankruptcy, so I know what you got to do. There are several things.
Well, just to be clear about that, John lived through the bankruptcy of Orange County.
Right. And so a state cannot file for bankruptcy, but I'm wondering if there's a form of receivership where some adults show up and say, okay, if you can't figure it out, legislature, because California's budget system is a joke. We're supposed to vote for a budget and have it approved by June 15th. Or if you don't, if the legislature doesn't, they don't get paid until they do. And so they're incentivized to vote for something on June 15th, and it's usually a joke. And then we get like months of trailer bills and it's like, we need to have a real budgeting. So we need real adults up in Sacramento and in leadership in these other 49 states or at least the states that are struggling with the unrestricted net deficits.
Joel, when you wrote the book about the emergence of neo-feudalism, was the comedic side of this part of what you were envisioning? Was this kind of like, constant jesters and jugglers?
Well, I mean, actually, as somebody who studied classical history, what we're seeing are many of the symptoms of the late Roman Empire: a debilitated currency, a decline in industry, and pervasive debt. The Roman Empire was, in some senses, destroyed by debt. It basically couldn't pay its soldiers anymore, and that was the end of that in the long run. So I think what we're really doing is creating the basis of a feudal future. And what's interesting is it's being done under the guise of progressive. Talk about historical analogy, but it's an amazing phenomenon.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for being our tour guides through the feudal future. This is an emerging issue. It's going to be very interesting to see whether adults do end up showing up and coming into the room. And would love to get your thoughts on a future podcast about where all of this has evolved to. So thank you for being guests on the Feudal Future podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The feudal future.